Welcome to another video. This is a third part in a multi-part series on replacing rocker panels on a Mercury Sable station wagon, which is behind me. This is the passenger side of the car, which I'm not doing a video on. The video is all the driver's side, but they're similar. And this is part of the way through the process with building the inner rocker panels, which we're going to be starting in this video. And if you missed the other videos, be sure to check back in the channel there and view them. The first video focuses on just removing the rusty rocker panel, and the second video picks up on that, and we remove the initial rust that's going to be replaced. And then in this video we begin welding and replacing the back part of the rocker panel. So thank you for stopping by. Let's get started. Alrighty, here we are where we left off the last video. We had removed all the initial rusty parts and the outer rocker panel, and as promised we're going to start putting some metal in. And first we're going to take and clean up our dirt mess with some of this wax and grease remover in one clean rag, and soak it with it, and then just start wiping where we had ground. And while doing this, just watch and be sure you don't cut your finger on any of the sharp metal. It don't wipe real easy because you're not like wiping a smooth painted surface with the grinder. And then afterwards, just take and dry it off with another rag, and its purpose is just so primer and that sticks good and perhaps prevents some rust in the future. Who knows? It's like I say, every little bit don't hurt as far as I'm concerned. Now, if you noticed, I had mentioned earlier we had removed some of the rust, which we have, but back around that dog leg and such, there will be more to be removed in later videos, but I want to start putting some metal in. There's enough out now to start fabricating pieces and start making a car again instead of just a big pile of rust laying around. In addition, this is the third video in a series on doing this. If you missed the other two, I'll be sure to put links in the description. But this is part 3 where we're actually going to be starting to, again, make pieces. Because, yeah, I have the outer rocker panel bought, but it don't help you any on this inner metal that was rusted away. And the inner metal serves two purposes. One, to keep the dirt and that out from getting to the outer rocker panel, and number 2 is safety. Okay, now we're going to take and spray some of this filler primer over the bare metal before we install. Again, rust preventative measure. Oh, I forgot to mention the primer I'm using is the high build filler primer. I bought it at Harbor Freight. It's around $3.99 a can, and it works good. Even though it's not technically, they do make a special weld through primer that costs about twice as much. This seems to work, and it will strike an arc on it underneath the, like where we'll be doing plug welds here in a short time. And again, you'll burn some off till you're done, but some will stay in place, and it's a good starting point. Now we are measuring for this complete back part of the rocker panel, and it's 3.5 inches down where I'm going to make it. It's actually around 3, but I want a little extra. You can always trim off, but if you don't make it wide enough to start with, you'll be in trouble when you go to put the outer rocker panel on. Alrighty, here's patching sheet metal I purchased at 2 foot by 4 foot long piece of sheet metal at the local hardware store that we have locally that sells a bunch of car body parts. I mentioned that in video too, but like I say, I'm going to put several marks at the 3.5 inches to be sure to draw a straight line across them. And again, as long as I can make the first piece, I mean, we actually need longer, is 4 foot long, because that's as long as the metal I purchased is. And that's a good, like I say, we'll add to it down the road in the future. Yes, if you're doing this, you're going to need extra metal. You're going to have to find the means. Again, I'm lucky and have that place. It's called Surplus City that sells discount sheet metal. Like this 2 foot by 4 foot piece of sheet metal was $29.99 plus tax. But if you go to like the big box hardware stores, you'll go broke doing this. You'll have to find probably like a welding shop or something if there's no such of a place in your area. There is a few surplus cities throughout in Pennsylvania. It's a very small chain, but otherwise, if you live in another part of the country, you'll just have to do some research where you can get a good deal on patchy metal.
Okay, now pretty simple. We're just little marks we made. We're just taking a square and drawing a straight line, and now we're going to take the angle grinder and start cutting where we marked. Get our first piece here ready to install back in the car. And yes, over the years I've found I started with just a lousy pair of tin snips when it came to cutting metal. That's no good. And I've tried various means, but when it comes to just cutting a piece of sheet metal, when you can get it out on sawhorses, an angle grinder, a 4-inch or a 4.5-inch, this is actually a 4-inch one here I'm using, is about as good as it comes. Just be careful. You see I have the guard on the grinder and the gloves on, being cautious. I did have a bad grinder experience once a couple years ago, but that was working on exhaust. Alrighty, we cut the 4-foot length. We got that taken care of, and we don't have to cut any more on the length of it because we're going to use all 4 feet. And as I said, we actually need altogether it'll be about 6, but we'll be adding to it down the road. But where the seat belt, this here bolt, the nuts that is welded to the car, needs to trimmed around so it'll fit up in and do what it's supposed to do. And here I'm going to measure. I want to butt weld it up to this front there behind the A-pillar. I'm going to measure how far in. I do actually have to cut the little notch there that it'll go in, which for all practicality looks like it's about 1 inch is what we need. I'm going to take and speed square or mark the corners here. Speed square is a handy tool on this marking metal, besides that and the marker. And now we're going to take, it is 1 inch. I'm just going to use the speed square sitting straight down on it, which it's like 15/16. It's close enough to 1 inch. And now we're going to cut the notch out using the 3-inch cutoff tool because the angle grinder is too big and clumsy to cut in this fine area. And as with so many of my tools, yes, this electric cutoff tool did come from Harbor Freight. And this does handier in its tight spots, although the wheel's getting sort of small on it, which is good here. But the small problem, it seems to be the little wheel isn't wanting to, with the guard on, do what I need to do. I'm going to have to be a bad boy here and take the guard off to trim in these little corners. But it's, like I say, we'll take care of it. Now we'll just knock it loose with the hammer. And we'll take here and get our gloves on, and we'll grab it and break it off. And we're going to take and walk back over to the car here and fit it in place. And again, this video is a guideline on your rust repair and rocker panels. Yours may need more repair, which I feel sorry for you. It may not be as rusty, but I'm telling you the measurements and giving you the guide. This is probably sort of about average you're going to see, maybe a little worse than average, I don't know, but okay, we have it clamped in place, and I want to put a mark down about like right here at where the floor meets the piece that comes down where we had removed the rocker panel from. And then I'm just going to take and mark this with the speed square. There's a purpose here coming, you'll see. Oh, the one I meant to say earlier, where the floor meets the panel that comes down from the door opening. I don't know what I was thinking, but okay. Now we're just going to take, is the inch down. We're just going to use our edge of the speed square and put the mark across. And then we're going to take every couple inches here and just put a little mark here with the marker. What we're going to be doing here is drilling holes here. Now, the reason we're going to do plug welds along with welding the whole thing to make it stronger, which we'll walk you through this. You don't want to do this on yours. If you're doing this, that's fine. You just want to weld the seams good. But I think it'll make it stronger. And again, pull the metal in tighter with less chance of moisture getting in behind. Yes, when it comes to repairing rust, this fabricating panels, and that's what takes longer than anything. It's a shame like the outer rocker panel you can buy, but you cannot buy any of this inner rocker panel stuff, so you just have to make do with what you can. And I guess I shouldn't complain. At least, again, the outer rocker panel is available. Without that, this whole thing would be, I would never even taken the project on. It's not even my car. It's my cousin's husband's car. I had mentioned that in previous videos. Okay, here we're just putting a little mark every about 2 inches, 2.5. It don't have to be precise, but I'm just giving myself an idea how I want to space these holes to be drilled that we're going to be doing the plug welds in a short time. There is sort of an ironic thing on this car, which I had a chuckle at. The car was rust proof once upon a time. The little labels around the car and the little black plastic plugs where they drilled holes to spray in the rocker panels and that rust proofing. Yeah, it sort of does make me chuckle, but anyhow. Okay, now we're going to just put a junk 2x4 underneath this on our sawhorse before we drill and clamp it down in place. So we can just focus on drilling and not have to worry about fighting the metal, holding it with one hand and trying to drill with the other. Been there and done that. And currently I'm using an 1/8 inch drill bit to drill the first hole. I'm actually going to go up to about 3/16, but I'm going to drill the 1/8 and all of them first, and then we'll just get a 3/16 inch bit. If you want to just do the 3/16 and force through the metal, that's good, but I think it again makes it easier. It saves wear and tear on the drill bits, and 1/8 inch drill bits especially. I have a lot of them. They're a lot less money than all the other bits. And we're proceeding right along on drilling these holes. Nevertheless, going to have to take care and loosen the clamp up and slide the metal back, because now I'm out from underneath my 2x4, my scrap piece there to use to drill underneath. Okay, now we can go back and drill some more again. Okay, now I'm going to switch bits here anyhow and go up to the 3/16 and go back through the ones we had just drilled. And you can see, since you already have the 1/8 inch hole, that's just basically you're just reaming it out a little bit. It's just right through, no problem, like the knife through the hot knife through butter, old cliche that's worn out, but yes, it does work about the same. Okay, there we have that, and we're going to loosen it up, and we're going to pull down here on the other side of the notch we cut and finish drilling our 3/16 inch holes. These already have the 1/8 inch hole in it, so just have to do that, and we can get on the way of getting some more stuff done here for today. Yes, actually, I'm looking forward to welding. I enjoy welding, and it's a sign things are going back together. And once we're through this, we're all but there, and I'll give you some tips and pointers on that. Okay, and that is that for drilling those holes for the plug welds here in the future. And we're just going to turn it over so it fits nice and where we went through with the drill. This is sort of, I'm sure you probably know this. If you don't, this is your first time, if you want to try a project like this, you will. But just as, like I say, just clean it up so it's smooth where the drill went through. No big deal. Like I say, quick and easy, simple task here. Just makes it nice, like I say, fit it nice against the car. Oh, and another thing, again, if you are tackling something this rusty, you are going to need a welder. And on that, that's sort of something you can watch what I do. You can read books, but practice, practice, practice. If you've never welded it before, you're going to need some practice probably before you're going to be able to just rip in and go to town on it. But that's, again, live and learn. Yes, I first welder was back in 2006, and I'll be honest with you, and I still have more to learn, but till I really could say I was getting pretty decent at it, such there wasn't until probably about 2010, about 4 years into it, with the sheet metal, where I started to get better. I tried just ripping into doing sheet metal. It's quite a bit harder, but it was welding thicker metal, like 1/8 inch steel, and that, which is easier. Started getting you the feel of it, and did get you going in the right direction. Now, before we move on here, this is something that's going to haunt later on, is this emergency brake cable, the bracket removed with that rusty piece of metal, and I want to take care of it now so when the time comes for reassembly, it's ready to put back together. Also, right now with the backing of the rocker panel going, it's easy to access, although it's tight. You see the wrench slip, so we're going to put a little heat on it and get it hot, and hopefully I don't snap it off. I don't really want to buy an emergency brake cable. They're not the cheapest, and again, it's not my car. Let's see if this does the trick here. I've had a fair amount of success with this on emergency brake cables in the past. I wasn't even going to include this in the video because it's sort of off track of it, but yet it is an easy time to get to it, and I figured I'd throw this little tip in, and as you see, the heat did work. It's starting to turn. It's a smoking. Don't touch the metal after you heat it. And if you don't have an actual torches, I'll include a link. You can buy a little torch kit, Burns-O-Matic. It's home improvement stores, and that doesn't work bad. I used to have one before I actually had torches, and it will get you out of a lot of messes, and potentially could save you some money in the long run, like this cable, if you would have ended up otherwise snapping this off. And emergency brake cables, usually, the last ones I purchased, usually started about $25 on up to $50. They are one of the more, for what they amount to, one of the more costly items on a car. But again, every little bit of money saved in the long run helps, even if you do gotta buy some tools to save the money, and there it is separate. And now we're just simply gonna take our vice grips off and be cautious here. Fill this situation out. It's been a couple minutes. It's alright, and then we'll take the little adapter there that connects the two off and lay it to the side for reassembly, which will be a while. And now we're going to fit our piece up into the car and get it clamped in. It's sort of hard to hold yourself and clamp, but I sort of have it steady, and then we're going to get the front vice grips there at the corner on, and then we're going to put it back up in place, and then we can get a pair of vice grips here at the back corner once I find them, and wiggle up in where we're going to end up starting that with the next piece. And then we're going to take this big wide C-clamp, well, not so much wide, but it's deep, and we're going to clamp in as showed there back around behind to get a few welds started in. Yeah, I bought the funny C-clamp at Harbor Freight. It does work good, the deep mouth in it. It is getting stretched from a lot of usage, and then I'm going to use just a more conventional size C-clamp that just gets in. And again, once time goes along, you won't need the clamps once you start getting tacks of weld down the metal. Another alternative to clamping, and I find it acceptable there just for temporary, you can always use a few rivets there to hold the metal in place. And here we're doing our first welding of the project. Alright, now while the metal's good and hot, we're going to grab a punch and a hammer and tap the metal back in. That's one of the great things with MIG welding. When the metal's still hot after you do a spot and you take and do this, you can really form the metal real nice and tight into place. And now we're going to take and do a plug weld. Start in the center of that 3/16 inch hole and just sort of working a circular motion to the outer edges, and it makes a plug weld. It takes the place of a spot weld since I don't have a spot welder. And there we have that taken care of. Okay, now we're going to do a little bit of more metal forming with the ball peen part of the ball part of the ball peen hammer, and we're going to bring our vice grips up in a little tighter, and we're going to see if we can get a tack here, a weld on this corner, and that'll be sort of a nice section. And if you notice when I start the welder, I angle it towards the new piece of metal and then just sort of work my weld back into the old metal. Now while it's hot, do a little more tapping with the punch and the hammer. And if you notice, since it's not a whole lot of spots holding yet, when I was welding, it kept wanting to pull away the metal. So that is again where you get a fair amount of stitch welds across, you have to stop and do the hammer. Now we're going to take, now this should stay in place, we're going to take and run another bead of weld. And if you notice while I'm welding, I like weld a second, pause, weld a second, pause. That's sort of with sheet metal what you have to do or you'll end up burning holes in it. And even being careful at times you also will. And on this I will put a link in the description. The welder I'm using is a Hobart MiG 140. And the wire I'm using is 30 thousandths, and the flux cord wire, that's the white yellowish powder you see is the flux cord. You can also buy the gas mixture and use the solid wire. I found that in the long run, because I live out in the sticks, just as good to buy the flux cord wire, and you don't have to worry about running out of gas in the middle of the project. But that's up to you. There's all sorts of, again, there's alternatives, but it don't make as nice of a looking weld, but again, like with body work, well, like what we're doing now, you won't ever see. And even where place you're going to see, you still have to, even with the gasless, the solid wire and the nicer weld, you still have to grind it and that anyhow to finish it off, so it doesn't really matter anyhow. And even with the solid wire and gas, you're not going to get a perfectly smooth weld because you still have to pause between welds, or again you'll burn holes in the metal, and you're never going to get that continuous long, absolutely perfect looking bead out of it. Okay, we're putting some more to it there, another tack weld. And after here, quickly follow up here, we're going to do our deal with the punch and the hammer again. Because again, it was starting to pull away. Again, once you get one of these spots done about every 3 inches, then you won't, when you go back through in between, you won't have to worry about it. And right now, while I'm doing the stitch welds on the Hobart, I'm running the heat setting number 2 on it. Now, when we go back through later on, I'll make a little reminder on this. Then I back the heat down to number 1, the lowest setting. And here we're doing another plug weld. And when I'm doing the plug welds, I always run the heat setting number 2 on the welder. And we're tapping another plug weld in nice and tight. And before you do the plug weld, also try to do your stitch weld above each one so it don't pull away as much. The plug welds do work nice, but they do want to pull away more so than even welding the straight seam. Alrighty, now the time's come to move our clamps. Again, this is an awkward position where you have to weld this backing part of the rocker panel in. It's not the easiest to clamp. In certain situations, you could probably, most of the time, get a way to clamp stuff better, but it's doing the job. And the more experience you have, the more you can work around it. And again, as I mentioned earlier, pop rivets for temporary holding is always another choice. And now we're moving our clamps up front. There we're putting our more conventional, I think it's like about an 8-inch C clamp. We're clamping it in around the between the backing part of the rocker panel and the inside part of the floor. And now this deep mouth one, we're going to take it and as far as we can put it back towards the B-pillar in the car and clamp it down and hold our metal in place. And again, once we get some welds in, then it's not as important. And there's the finally how I have it clamped at the moment. And it also holds the wires back out of the way, so when we go to weld they won't melt. Alrighty, now the time has come here. We're going to put a little stitch weld here right below the seat belt nut part that, like I say, fastens it to the car. And there we got a little, that's sort of right in the middle of everything on this backing part of the rocker panel. Yeah, if you don't currently own a welder, that's something to, before you make a purchase, I wouldn't necessarily recommend buying the cheapest you find. But do some research on it. There is a variety of options. But again, if you get a little bit better quality welder, you will have an easier time learning. I started with a different one. that was probably the cheapest, and it was harder to learn on. I picked it up, but once I bought this Hobart, it made it so much easier. But probably initially to start with, instead of buying per se like a $300 welder, put about another $200 to it or three, and go into $500-600 range, and you'll get a lot better machine that's capable of welding thinner metal like this, and on the other hand thicker. That was the problem with that first welder I had. It didn't have a low enough heat setting to really handle the sheet metal, and then on the other hand, anything much thicker than an 1/8 inch. I have a tractor, an old farm tractor. I needed to do some welding on some 1/4 inch 3/8 inch thick metal, and on the other hand, it wouldn't handle that unless you could get it from both sides and weld. But on the other hand, the Hobart sort of handles as you see, the 20 gauge sheet metal fine, and on the other hand, it'll handle up to 3/8. I pulled off my deal with the welding stuff on the old tractor and such. It's sort of and it still works on 120 volts because I don't have any 220 in the garage. That was sort of a necessity. I didn't want to go into having to rewire the garage. Alrighty, now just taking a wire brush and cleaning up some of that flux. That's something I don't think I've done so far showed in the video. It's just sort of a step in between there. Because a lot of times where you go to start, especially like later on when we start piecing the stitch welds together, that flux will not let the arc make with the MIG gun, and it'll give you trouble till you take the wire brush to it. Okay, we're going to go and run another stitch weld. And just as before, after you do the stitch weld, take the hammer and the punch and tap the metal in tight, and then do another little stitch weld a couple inches apart. So again, you sort of just repetition. That, and I'm trying to show you the welding process as good as I can with the camera without any major harm to the camera. It's sort of a little tricky, but I'll admit, actually, when you're welding, it sort of just looks like a flash, but it's close enough. I think you get the drift before it cools. You can see where the molten puddle had been run. And here we're just simply doing another one of the plug welds again. Here, giving you a little different view. You can actually tell when you're getting in tight with the metal, because when you first start tapping in, it sounds real tinny, but when you get against the backing part, if you notice, it has a more solid thud sound when you're tapping with the punch and the hammer, or even just the hammer straight. And again, you can see where I was welding, it was starting to burn the metal, so I quit while at the time and let it cool, and we'll go back to it. And in place of it, I decided to do another plug weld while that cools. And there is another one of the plug welds completed. And we're going to take and clean with the wire brush again. And that's again a handy thing to have in hand. You actually go through a good many of them. They wear out. You doing a lot of welding, you're down to no wire bristles left on them at all in hardly no time, but at least they're pretty cheap. I think the one I'm using came like a 3-pack at Harbor Freight, and I want to say it was only like $3, basically $1 wire brush. And now we're just moving our clamps up a little bit more to get the metal to hold in tighter up further, and we'll soon have a stitch weld the whole length of the panel at the top, and then it'll become easier to do. But even right now, at least it's not going to fall off. And another little area of the stitch weld done. That cooled right off, and tapping it in again with the punch. Repeat all the time, and we'll keep getting more done as we go along. Patience is the name of the game. The big key on this rust repair, I made this point in the other two videos, is not so much what you see on the outside, like when you first start on this and you see the rusty rocker panel, but it's what lies underneath, which is what we're working on now. This is the surprise of the project. Nevertheless, I'm not surprised. I've been doing it long enough. I've not shocked at anything when it comes to rust. It's always more than what you initially see on the outside. I've been doing this since the early 90s. Until the late 90s, I've pretty much come to the conclusion there's never an exception for the better. It's always worse than what it appears on the surface when it comes to rust repair. This, again, I'm giving you my knowledge and best experience, and if you've never done it before, you can make a decision if you want to get into a project like this or not. It's not being color-coded or anything, and that's why I'm showing everything the whole way through, not just cutting out big parts and making it look nice and easy, like the big-time television shows that can restore a car in one episode and make it look so easy and simple. It's really a lot more to that, and again, I don't want anybody to be disillusioned on it. You'll know what you're getting into. You can take notice that really, you could see when I was using the punch, that really pulled that metal in good and tight, which means we're starting to make good progress on it, and it's really starting to become molded in with the car disc replacement metal, which is great, and moving our clamps a little bit farther up. Again, that is a shame on this. It's just such of a pain to clamp with that door opening and how that metal like comes out over like a overhang of a cliff down over it, but we're making do with it. And in some respects, you can say the clamps are in the way of welding, but on the other hand, that come in handy. That gave like a resting place to put my wrist to help aim the MIG gun and guide the weld nice, which helped at times. Again, they can work in your favor if you position them right, although it's still, I just as soon not have them in the way, and once we get it again completed, we won't need them. Now we're up here. Now this is actually, we're buttoned to welding to this. That piece of the car up above and new sheet metal, how I trimmed it out. Butt welding, you have to be a little more cautious since you don't have any backing metal. It is easier to burn a hole in it, and it was starting to. That's why I only did probably about half the length as I was earlier where it was overlapping the metal, but tap it back in place good, and we'll get another fresh bite on it and weld another little spot, and then it'll all be taken care of. Now, if you listen in the background, you can hear the welder has a fan on it. Now, the cheaper welders don't have a fan, but this does. It helps keep it cool, although I've never reached a duty cycle on the welder. Not welding sheet metal, because you're not welding that much straight ahead. I think this Hobart has a 20% duty cycle, which means you could weld 2 minutes out of 10 straight. But again, this type of work, I've never surpassed the duty cycle on it yet, but nevertheless it does make me feel good to fan, because that old one didn't have a fan, and I'll admit I don't think I ever exceeded the duty cycle with never stopped, but I think the fan is a good idea. It saves the wear and tear on the welder and keeps the heat down in it, and hopefully everything. Well, I've owned this since 2014, so it's done a good job. I've only had one problem with it, and that was while for working on this car, not yet, but in some later videos, I had to replace the MIG gun. The trigger was going bad in that one that came with it from brand new, and the trigger was like half the cost of a whole another MIG gun with everything, the cable and that, and the liner, so I just purchased on Amazon a Yes Welder MIG gun, and I'm very pleased with it. But again, I'm still using the original here, but in upcoming videos I will be on the new one. It was getting to the point sometimes you'd hit the trigger, it wouldn't do nothing, just click, and sometimes it would. It was starting to get on my nerves, and I think that's some of the trouble even here I've been having there. It's starting to, like I say, it's not as effective as it should be. It's not making always connection. And see, I talked about it, it did give a sort of a dud there when I first started before I turned the big gun around. We're just taking again our old deal with the punch and the hammer, and now we're going to take and run another little stitch weld here at the corner. Oh, and I didn't mention it earlier, where I'm doing the butt weld, I also cranked the heat back to 1 on this, because it was in number 2 setting. It would have been, I'm sure, burning holes in it, because it's borderline even on the lowest setting. Okay, now we've got those where we're going to be doing the plug welds nice and pushed in towards the backing metal. Yeah, the welder not making contact. You could blame the flux, but again, as I learned it, you'll get some of that. The flux won't let it make an arc again, but it was doing it more often than usual. And it definitely, again, in later videos, was the MIG torch. It solved most of the problem. I mean, again, yeah, at times you'll run into the flux will not let you start again. Alrighty, we made a fair amount of progress here. I'm just going to eliminate this one C-clamp and get it out of the way, and we're going to put another, still doing stitch welds. We're not quite to the point of connecting these welds yet, but we're getting close. And as usual, if you have any questions or anything about the video, feel free to post in the comments below. I might not get back right away. I usually about 1 or 2 times a week check them and comment. Or if you are in a hurry, you can go to my website, alanmytc.com. I'll put the link right up there above, and you can use the contact form, which will come to my personal email, and that way I will get back to you if you have a specific question about a video and have anything that I can answer. I'll see what I can do for you. Oh, and if you notice that last weld when I started, right here I'm doing the same thing. I'm starting on where there was already a stitch weld. Once you already have a few welds built up, that decreases the chance of burning a hole in it if you can start your welder right on where a weld had stopped. Just a little tip on that. Alrighty, we finally got that. It's working up around that little bit of a curve in that butt weld. It was wanting to fight, but we did overcome the battle. And we're going to give this a good tap with the ball peen, part of the ball peen hammer. And here we're going to get another stitch weld. This is a pretty big area. You sort of forgot to put one. I guess that was because of the clamps were not really holding in this area. But now there's enough otherwise. I think we're good to go. And there's another little spot. And then back with the punch. Alrighty, since we have a lot of stitch welds done and more of it's holding, there we actually did do a nice, fairly long section at one time. Now, just we're back to the tapping again. Same old, same old. But yeah, we're getting there pretty good. Now we're going to do another plug weld. Yeah, that gun at times messing up that one plug weld there. I see I burn around the metal a little bit too much. That was something I'll go back through and take care of. You can always go back and touch them up. Yeah, right here, a little general overview of what we have accomplished so far. This is below the front door opening, and you can see we're getting there. There's some actually places that about 3-4 inches is welded, and then there's some places there we're going to here make another longer area. Yeah, I should have went out another wrench and completed it, but I somehow wasn't seeing good there between the smoke from the flux and just where the light was. But, well, we'll get it all eventually. We'll get back to it. Yeah, that's one of the keys on welding, is you gotta be able to see good to weld good. And even with all the lighting and that, it's still at times you just sort of messes with you. But again, like I said, the smoke from the welder and such. And I'd use an auto darkening helmet, which is a great thing, but there's times if you hold your head wrong or something, they won't auto darken, and then you just you're temporarily blinded because of that. So there's things that do work against you. Alrighty, caught herself. Well, we're starting to get off track a little bit, but we'll clean it up with the wire brush and it'll pick up there, and we'll, like I say, we'll get it. Again, for whatever reason, I'm into a spot here. It's just tools are in my way and things are fighting against me, but we'll get it. Alrighty, it's time to step back away, and before we work back into this, sort of get a fresh look at it there, and we're going to take and work right here at the front door opening some more. Yeah, that's something, honestly. When I first started, the auto darkening helmet was a good thing, but I think actually now that I'm getting better at it, I just soon have the old school helmet that stays dark, because that's what I just had happen again, is it didn't darken. Just the angle, because you're looking in from the top, and it's just a small sensor in that helmet. And anyhow, here we welded another section, and this one we actually stayed on where we should have. And we're taking the punch here, and we're going to push it back in some more. Alrighty, there we got a pretty good section done. Now, I haven't did one of these for a while. I'm going to work on a plug weld. Okay, we have that done. Then we'll step back here, and we're getting a good bit of it taken care of. We have a good many complete seams. Still more to do, but I do believe we're getting to the point there's more welded than's not welded. Although now we got to start working towards the back. We've been focusing more up front, although we started in the back. I don't know if I mentioned it in this video or not. The sheet metal I'm using is 20 gauge. 20 gauge is as thin as you'd want, 18 or 20. Now probably if you want to get real technical, the car's probably like 16 gauge, which you're welding to. Now this wouldn't be hard, but upcoming with bending and that, which we're going to have to do to complete making this inner rocker panel, would be hard to work with, but it should do the job. Again, it's the choice I've used on a good bit of repair jobs over the years. And here we're going to run another bead of weld. In addition, the replacement rocker panels, I believe, are 18 gauge. So this will do the job. In the upcoming video, a little hint of things to come. Now there is one place we will be using 1/8 inch thick steel, but that will be, like I say, in the next video, and that's the reason of that. It rusted away where you lift the car with the jack to come with the car, or if you like take it to a garage and they put it up on a 2-post lift, we're going to have to make it good and substantial. And again, that's what I will be using. You'll want to tune in to see progress on that coming up. Yeah, when it comes to this type of work, I enjoy the welding, I think, more than any of it. I'm not really the biggest. I think the least favorite part's fabricating the parts. Now, this piece here wasn't bad or straight, but upcoming when you have to start bending metal and figure out pieces that are so rusted away there isn't much of a guideline. But yeah, the welding itself, I think, is actually the most fun of the whole job. And as you notice, when you get farther along, you can do larger areas at a time, and you don't have to worry about the clamps, which makes it a lot easier. And here we're looking down on some welding action, a little bit of a different point of view. That's another thing I've been trying to do, is give you different points of view that you can see what is going on through the project of the welding process. And another thing you want to do at times when you're welding sheet metal, sort of jump around that you're not always making the same area hot. I mean, we're dealing with a 4-foot long piece of metal here. We're going to jump here another spot and let the area where we were working cool some. And there we got a little bit more done. And I wanted to pull away, so back to our punch again and the hammer. It's, again, a few tools here to the trade. As far as picking up, the plug welds are actually rougher to do and the same in my opinion if you're just starting, but that's just my opinion. It took me a while to actually succeeded on those, that they'd actually hold good. And probably when I actually really started having success was when I went to the Hobart welder from the original one I had started with. Alright, here we're back to the wire brush again. And another thing you could do, I started doing this, I'm not doing a video on it on the passenger side on this car, but instead of the wire brush, I have conclusion, as much as cleaning the flux as I was doing, I just put a wire wheel in the cordless drill and been cleaning them up that way. It does a nicer job and quicker. Again, this is probably the most welding I've came into with one project since I've been doing it. Although a close second, and I have videos on YouTube, I repaired a core support on a GMC Safari. That was a lot of welding, Not quite as much as this car, but that was a good bit. And you can see we're getting a bunch of it done. I say we're about 80% of the way there now. And there's another looking down on the welding process. As mentioned earlier, the disadvantage with the flux wire is the mess it makes with the flux, and you get extra splatter too there. Not really the end of the world. But on the plus, as I mentioned earlier, you don't need shielding gas. And there's another one if you're like I used to be once upon a time. You have the proverbial outside garage. In other words, you're working in your driveway. You don't have to worry about a windy day because the wind doesn't affect the flux core welding like it does the shielding gas. So that's another plus of the flux core wire. I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages, but it has, I think, more advantages than the disadvantage. Okay, now we're going to come here and work around this nut for the seat belt. This is a little bit with that seat belt nut in the way. Is a little bit tricky to get the right angle and get the bead to flow, but we're getting it. And do remember when you're welding to keep the heat towards the piece of metal, the new, and then just sort of again when you get your molten puddle, sort of just carefully at the angle, sort of work your puddle back and forth and start closing the seam. If you can see, that's sort of the key on being able to see good. You can watch what you're doing with it. And on the other hand, if at any time you start just piling up a big pile of weld and nothing's going any place, well then you have to do something to get the molten metal to start flowing around. And if you look back at that corner, you can see what I was saying. I wasn't really getting the bead working earlier. It was sort of piled up, and also there was even a piece of wire that didn't melt that just sort of came out of the mid-gun, and just due to the improper gun angle and didn't have the puddle flowing properly. And here down below the spot I'm having a little trouble again, but it is going. It must be the vertical angle on it that's giving the hassle. And later on in the video, and that's a real pain, I will do a little overhead welding where we're going to be joining some pieces together, but that's another that'll be upcoming, not in this video, and that I'm definitely need some work on. That's something even the most professional has trouble with. Okay, and now we're going to do a little bit more right there. Again, it's still, you see what I'm saying, it's fighting, but we're got it about. If we can keep contact with the welding wire. And I'm going to call that good enough. Now we're looking up through. This is all done, this is all done. But here down below that nut we're going to pick up right there is not completed yet. Alrighty, there's that little area done. I'm going to run the wire brush as we have so many times. Again, don't forget the drill tip I threw in. And here, you can see we're strong. I'm grabbing it and it's shaking the car. And it don't have the rest of the inner rocker panel to it yet, which will even make it stronger yet. And here we're going to weld this a little bit more. I wasn't quite done, I lied. Yeah, I should have gave a little bit more of a gap between the seatbelt nut and the metal, but it's making it extremely tricky. But I more or less welded to the bracket for the seatbelt, the nut, instead of the backing there, but it'll work. And on that, you could probably, again, this is your call, you could probably just do stitch welds every couple inches and not weld the whole seam. I chose to weld the whole seam, but to each his own. It would probably suffice. And this hole, that was all drilled in the car for whatever reason. In the upcoming video, we're going to make the hole again to the size it was and work on it. That'll be in the next video. But on the other hand, on the passenger side, another tip, I just run the metal father up because I didn't really see any real purpose in it. It had a piece of black duct tape from the factory over it, really what purpose it was. So that's something, again, an option. Now this one here is a little trickier to weld because if you remember, the metal's not overlapping. We're butt welding new metal to the pieces left on the car, and it's working, but it is a little bit trickier to do. And there we got it, and cleaning it up with the wire brush, we're just about there. As a matter of fact, on this backing part, this first part, all we have to do is weld this about 1.5 inches here on this vertical seam at the front part of the panel we put in, and that's going to be where we're going to be calling this video. Now this again is part 3 in a multi-part series, and you can, again, from what you've watched, make a decision if you want to fix your car or not fix your car. Again, I'm trying to show you the facts that you can make an educated choice. Plus, on the fixing it, you'll gain a whole new set of skills in that, and probably some tools till you're done. And on the disadvantage of fixing it there, probably an older car and that, you can argue, is it worth the money? But that is your call, and there is where we will be picking up in the next video.